Добрый день.
Hi everyone, today my guest is Paul Goble once again, which is a professor and specialized on Soviet Union and post-Soviet period.
Сегодня мы снова зададим вопросы, те вопросы, которые вы задавали мне. Э,
Today I will ask him the questions that you left on comments on the last video, so we'll see his expert's opinion on that questions.
Мы услышим от него экспертное мнение. Здравствуйте, уважаемый Пол Гобл.
Dear Paul Goble, today I'd like to start our interview with the questions about sanctions on Russia and what will it bring to Russia? Will it bring the same results that the sanctions on Soviet Union or Iran?
Ирана, допустим, как сейчас происходит ситуация.
In today's world, sanctions are very important. They are more important than many people understand. They are not simply designed, not simply intended to force other countries to change their policy, but to reflect the values of the people who impose those sanctions and to send a message to the people in the countries whose governments have violated the rules that the United States and the West does not accept that situation. But equally important, it is to send a message to the world that there is such a thing as international law and that it must be obeyed. Some people talk now that because sanctions have not resulted in a change in policy in Moscow or other places, that there is no reason to continue them. But if sanctions were to be removed, that would have far more negative consequences than not having put them in place in the first place. Given that, then it would be clear that any criminal state can do what it wants, and if it waits long enough, Western countries will sacrifice their principles in order to gain some kind of temporary agreement. That would be a tragedy, not only in the case of the Russia of Vladimir Putin, but of Iran, and it would send a message to other countries around the world that the way to behave is to get yourself a nuclear weapon so that you never have to say you're sorry and you never have to back down. And the consequence of that would be a world with perhaps 20 or 30 nuclear states. And in such a situation, it is almost certain that within a decade or even less, there would be a nuclear exchange, something more horrible than most people can even imagine. So sanctions against Moscow, sanctions against Tehran are a way of expressing the commitment of the West to its principles, sending a message to the peoples of Russia and Iran that we hope that they will join us in forcing their governments to change, and sending a message to peoples around the world that it is a mistake to try to hide behind nuclear weapons so that your governments can commit crimes in violation of international law.
Да, совершенно верно, Пол.
Yes, it is absolutely true, Paul. It's a big help for the people of Russia or Iran that the sanctions are existing, and I also understand that Russians have to take control of their future.
Поддержку, и я понимаю, что русские и россияне сами должны принимать участие в своей судьбе. И это правильно, это правильно. Я вот следующий вопрос, перейду к следующему.
Okay, so the second question is that is it possible that in the future sanctions against Putin's criminal regime could be removed and that Putin will be added back in the international political scene and treated as a respectable man as before?
I think that the chances that any conceivable sanctions would cause Vladimir Putin to change policy are quite limited. I would like to see far tougher sanctions than we have imposed, but I doubt that it will happen on Putin's watch. But Putin is not forever, and it is terribly important that when he is replaced, when he leaves the scene, however that happens, that the Russian people who come to form a new government will play by the rules of international law that Mr. Putin has so regularly violated. So it is important to put down that marker, not so much in the expectation that Putin will change his mind, but so that Russia after Putin can change itself and its relationship with the rest of the world.
Спасибо, спасибо, Пол.
Thank you, Paul. So we'll hope that after Putin, Russia will finally become a democratic country.
Страной. Я являюсь последовательным сторонником, Пол,
I am a supporter of the idea of Chechnya to join the European Union and NATO after the occupation of our country by Russia. Before yesterday, I shared this idea on my last live, and I get a lot of positive and negative comments about that. Even if it's a supposition at the moment, I'd like to know if it's possible for Chechnya to join NATO and what do we have to do to join it.
примут ли Ичкерию в НАТО и что после деоккупации нам нужно для этого сделать?
Well, I very much hope that the last empire will disintegrate and that its many peoples will have the choice, will have the chance to make a choice as to what future they will have. That choice should not be dictated by outsiders. It should be the choice of the peoples themselves, and it should not be dictated by those parts of the current empire who happen to have more weapons than others. It should be on the basis of the principle of the right of all peoples to self-determination, both as individuals and as nations, and that I believe that will happen. I believe that we have been watching the disintegration of the Russian Empire going on for more than 100 years, that it began in World War I and with the Russian Civil War. It continued in 1991, and I believe that it will continue some more. The process will be different. It will involve different actors. It will involve a much more complicated arrangement than the one we saw in 1991, but it is something which is not going to be stopped by anyone in the Kremlin or elsewhere. And so we have to think what kind of arrangements can be made, including assistance from the outside, so that the process is as peaceful and stable as it can be and involves the least loss of human life and the least amount of human suffering. The death of empires is always complicated. It always involves some violence. The task of the international community is to make the approaching death of this empire as nonviolent and as non-threatening and as peaceable, let's put it that way, as it can be. I think there is a role for a variety of institutions to play, but I think we have to remember that some institutions which could play a very positive role if there was no one around to respond to against them could in effect provoke situations that might make things worse. So proceeding cautiously is the best way, but being aware that this is a process that is very much in train and that is not going to be stopped is a requirement for all those who want to think about the future of Eurasia.
Да, спасибо, Пол. Я тоже на это очень надеюсь и тоже.
Thank you, Paul. I really hope for that too, and I really hope that the last empire will collapse and the people's jail will be destroyed, which will bring to these people the chance to live free, in freedom. And a final point will be placed on the question of the last empire.
Спасибо, и всем американцам спасибо, что вы к этому прилагаете усилия. Спасибо вам большое. Я знаю, кстати...
Thank you for your work and to Americans for what they are doing to make this happen. Thank you very much. I also like to send you a hello, a salam, a marshal, which means freedom in Chechen language, from Ilyas Akhmadov, our ex-minister of Foreign Affairs.
Тему с вами. Вот я уже знаю, что вы долго занимались проблемами стран Балтии и до приобретения.
Yesterday, I talked with him about a question that I'd like to ask to you. I know that you have worked on the problems about Baltic countries before they get their independence, and as we know, these countries have joined the European Union and NATO today. What do you think they did right or wrong, and what do you think we Chechens, who are currently living in Europe, have to learn from them to prepare the occupation of our land?
There is no nation within the borders of the Russian Federation today whose leadership was more committed to following the Baltic line than Chechnya. The first president of Ичкерия served in Estonia and was powerfully influenced by the Baltic Dream, which was to escape from being ruled from the Kremlin and to become part of a European family of nations. One of the great tragedies of the 1990s is that that dream was not realized because of Russian brutality. That had Chechnya been able to escape from the clutches of the Russian Federation, at that time, it would have been relatively easy, I believe, for it to integrate into Western institutions. It was a far more secular and democratic place 25 years ago than it has been thanks to the deformations imposed by the Moscow occupiers and by their agents in place, including Ramzan Kadyrov, and that it will now take some time to overcome not only the consequences of the Muscovite occupation, but also the consequences of the indigenous Chechen occupation by a regime that is anything but committed to Western values. It's not that that can't happen, but the process would have been far easier had it been true, had it been allowed to take place in the 1990s than it will be in the coming 2020s.
Я так понимаю, Пол, получается, что...
So, as I understand, we have to accentuate the question of the violations of the human rights committed by Russia, is it right? The genocide committed on Chechens by Russia. We have Seydemin Ibragimov, which is working on that question, and we hope that on the past, Johar Dudaev helped Estonia, we'll find an Estonian Johar Dudaev, which will help Ичкерия when we'll need it. And thank you for your advice, Paul. My next question is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the USA didn't work until the end, unfortunately. Why did the United States didn't dismantle the KGB? which was the same organization as the Gestapo, or maybe worse? And is it possible that they will escape from justice this time too? As we know, their organization is made by millions of people over the world. These people will the KGB will try to maintain their power and to maintain the people's jail, which is Russia, and these people won't try to create anything. They are not creators. They're only able to kill or torture peoples who are against them and also against their profits. And my question is that possible that the KGB will maintain its power after Putin and the US won't ask this organization to respond for its crimes as it was done on Nazis, for example?
It's never easy for a country that has been ruled one way to make a transition to another. It is also never easy for an outside country to make a major difference unless it has occupied it as a result of a war. The United States worked very, very hard to change German and Japanese society, and we achieved a great deal, I think, but we were in occupation, and we insisted that both countries recognize that they had lost, that their system had lost. I believe that the West approach to the Russian Federation after 1991 will be recognized in time as a major failure rather than a major victory. And here's why. First, the West talked a lot about its victory. It did not insist that the government in power in Moscow recognized that it had suffered a defeat. That never happened. Nobody said, everyone in the West said, we won. They did not say, you lost. Second, they did not insist on a repudiation of the ideology that had caused the Soviet Union to behave the way it did, and they did not insist on lustration. Third, instead of recognizing that what the Russian Federation needed was tough love, that is, a very clear signal of the rules that had to be followed, coupled with massive assistance, like the kind that we gave in the Marshall Plan to Western Europe after 1947, we adopted, I regret to say, a policy of weak neglect. We allowed the people who had been in the earlier regime to come back, to continue, and to operate much as they did before. The actions of the Yeltsin government, in all too many cases, were absolutely identical to the kind of actions you would have expected from Soviet leaders. And not only did we not insist on the rules being obeyed, but we did not provide the kind of massive assistance that any country going through this was going to need. As a result, people became angry, populist politicians blamed the West, and the result was Vladimir Putin, a leader committed to throwing the West out, to going back to some very old Soviet traditions. As someone once said, there are no ex-KGB officers, just as there are no ex-German shepherds. Putin was a KGB officer, he remains a KGB officer at heart, and he behaves accordingly. Someone like that should never have been allowed to be near the levers of power, should have been discredited by a thoroughgoing policy of lustration, and it should have been clear that the United States and the West wanted Russia to succeed, wanted the peoples of that country to have choices about their future, were prepared to help them, but were also insistent that they recognized that the government that had been in place in the Soviet Union up until December 1991 was a criminal state that needed to be rejected and repudiated, and that we expected the people in Moscow and in Kiev and in Tashkent to do just that. Yeah. Unfortunately, instead of, as I say, instead of a policy of tough love, we adopted a policy of weak neglect. And now we are paying a price for that, which is much higher and will be far more difficult to overcome than would have been had we adopted a very different policy in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes, I agree with you, Paul. But look, there was a video of Yeltsin during the revolution before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin was in front of the Lubyanka with angry protesters, and he seems very embarrassed because the people is wondering about to attack the building of the KGB. And Yeltsin says, we won't go there, we don't have to go there, when talking about Lubyanka. So the people knew exactly from where was coming the evil, but Yeltsin encouraged protesters to not attack it. And today we can see the same person known as Navalny. This man is a puppet, and I hope that Americans see who he really is. These puppets are the warranty of untouchability for the high-headed of this regime, which is Putin and its band. So they are ready to every compromise with their people, but not to change the regime. Okay, you want to switch from communist ideology to capitalistic one. Okay, let's do it. If you want, we can change everything, but not the regime and its head. Is it important for us that the West and the US, the United States, understand and are aware of who is the true evil on the Russian question?
О чем я хотел бы донести и до вас тоже.
I agree. I fear that we have not been willing to understand and to admit to ourselves that the problem was not just communism. The problem was what I call Soviet Russian imperialism, that we have been dealing with, and we're dealing with a threat to the West and to the peoples of the region that emanated less from a doctrine that came from Karl Marx than from something that has much deeper roots, and that the problem was and is much greater than the one we thought we could solve. It often happens that when people do not see a way to solve one problem, they will select another that they think they can solve. And the consequence of that often is that they address the wrong problem, and the problem they should have been addressed gets worse. I think that's fair comment as to what has happened in the last 30 years.
Да, спасибо, совершенно верно.
When I was talking about the West and the US, I wasn't talking about you, of course. I was talking about our English subscribers who listen our interview. I have more to learn about you, who work with these problems from the Soviet times, and who work with Abdurrahman Afturhanov, which was an anti-Soviet too. And I have a question about that. Today, our young people is facing a very big propaganda, which explains that Chechnya have to become a part of Russia or a caliphate, and war until the end of the times. So our young people are very disoriented because Russia committed a genocide on our country. It is currently occupying our lands and is bombing our people with fake news, and they are doing the same with Ukraine or the West in general, and we are not still protected against that. What do you think Abdurrahman Abdurhanov could advise to Chechen young people, and what could you advise to our young people?
Чеченской молодежи, чеченцам вот в этой сложной ситуации?
I think that Mr. Afterkhanov would say, and I would agree, that the struggle must begin within each of the young people of the region, who must recognize that the limits other people say they must operate in are not true. That very few people believed, as late as the beginning of December 1991, that the Soviet Union could come apart. Some people didn't believe it even after it happened. It is the fact that we live in a time when the impossible is nonetheless achieved, and that it is entirely possible to imagine a North Caucasus with many different peoples living together in a variety of arrangements, and that no one answer is going to be imposed on all of them, and that young people now should look forward to a future in which they can make choices, and they should reach out to others who want everyone to be able to make a choice, rather than assume that the people in charge now are the ones who are always going to be there. If history teaches us nothing else, it is that almost all the predictions about the future being like the present have turned out to be wrong. And that should give us courage.
Спасибо, Пол.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Remember that Bill Clinton asked to end the first Russo-Chechen war with the least blood. Then, remember that George Bush received the war criminal Shamanov to the White House. He was wearing his Medal of Hero of Russia at that moment. There is a photo of this meeting in the Oval Room, and we Chechens saw this and reacted to this very badly because Shamanov was a war criminal. It's well confirmed and well known information in Chechnya. Then Russian propaganda have shared the information that American army helped Russian army to assassinate Johar Dudaev by giving the information on the location to bomb, and there is even a photo of that. I am sure that this is a fake news, but your opinion is important to me. Some Chechens reacted to this information by saying how America could collaborate on the assassination of our president. And could you please express your opinion about that information, please?
As far as I know, there was no truth in that collaboration. I understand why people believe otherwise. We in the West made many, many, many mistakes, mostly out of ignorance. most people in the upper reaches of our government simply did not know what was going on, did not understand. It was hard enough for them to deal with one Soviet Union, let alone 15 countries. And then when you said, but those aren't all that are there, it got even more difficult. I do not believe that there was any such conspiracy. I do believe that Moscow has a vested interest in implying its existence because that would suggest that the Chechen people were more isolated than in fact they are. There are many, many people around the world who were supportive and are supportive, and they should not accept anything that Moscow says unless evidence is provided. So I was once asked about something that Mr. Putin had said, and I said, he's lying. And I was asked, how did I know that? And I said, he's moving his lips, that if he is talking, he is lying. That is unfortunately not something that most people are willing to say, but it is a not unimportant thing to learn.
Спасибо вам большое, Пол.
I would like to thank you for taking part on the creation of Radio Freedom, and thank you, Paul, for everything you did, for everything you are doing and are going to do. I would like to thank you very much for
До свидания.
thank you very much for everything.
До свидания.